Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore the Wright brothers and the invention of flight, a saga of grit, obsession, and the conquering of the impossible. For thousands of years, humanity looked upward with a mix of envy and despair, watching birds navigate the invisible currents of the air with effortless grace while we remained shackled to the earth by the unyielding laws of gravity. Throughout history, dreamers and madmen strapped feathers to their arms or launched themselves from towers, only to meet with tragedy, cementing the belief that the sky was the domain of gods, not men. Yet, at the turn of the 20th century, amidst the smoke and steel of the Industrial Revolution, two unassuming bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, dared to challenge this ancient impossibility. They possessed no university degrees, no government funding, and no frantic desire for fame, but they held a secret weapon, a profound, unified genius that would eventually lift the world off its feet. Imagine the sheer audacity required to believe that you, out of all the brilliant minds in history, could be the one to finally break the chains of Earth. Chapter 1: The Bishop's Sons. The story of human flight does not begin on a windswept dune, but in the quiet, intellectual warmth of a Midwestern living room where ideas were the most valued currency. Wilbur and Orville Wright were the sons of Milton Wright, a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, a man who ruled his household with stern morality but encouraged an open, boundless curiosity in his children. Their mother, Susan Kerner Wright, was equally formidable, possessing a rare mechanical mind that allowed her to design her own appliances and build custom sleds for her boys. It is fascinating to consider that while the father provided the spiritual and intellectual architecture of their minds, it was the mother who gave them the hands to build their dreams. The spark that would eventually ignite the world was struck in 1878, when the bishop returned from a church trip with a small, peculiar object concealed in his hands. He tossed the toy into the air, and instead of falling, it hovered and danced across the room, powered by a twisted rubber band and cork rotors. It was a helicoptere, designed by the French pioneer Alphonse Pénaud, and for the young brothers, this fleeting moment of sustained flight was nothing short of magic. That tiny, buzzing toy did not just fly across the parlor, it flew straight into their imaginations, planting a seed that would lie dormant for years before blooming into an obsession. As they grew, the brothers became inseparable, forming a partnership so cohesive that they often signed their letters simply as the Wright brothers, as if they were a single entity with two bodies. Wilbur, the elder, was the visionary, intense, brooding, and capable of deep, sustained periods of intellectual focus that bordered on trances. Orville was the counterweight, optimistic, mechanically brilliant, and possessed of a bubbling energy that kept the dark clouds of Wilbur's intensity at bay. Together, they created a perfect psychological and intellectual seal, a closed system where ideas could be challenged, dismantled, and rebuilt without the interference of the outside world. Despite their brilliance, their path was not a straight line toward glory, it was marred by disappointment and the quiet struggles of ordinary life. Wilbur's plans for Yale were shattered by a hockey accident that smashed his teeth and plunged him into a deep depression, leaving him housebound for 3 years to care for his dying mother. During this dark period, he retreated into the family's vast library, devouring books on science and history, unconsciously preparing his mind for the great problem that lay ahead. It is haunting to think that had Wilbur not suffered that injury, he might have become a scholar or a minister, and the airplane might have remained a dream for another generation. Following their mother's death, the brothers turned their restless energy toward the practical world of business, first with a printing press and then, serendipitously, with bicycles. The safety bicycle craze was sweeping across America in the 1890s, offering a new form of freedom and mobility that resonated with the nation's industrial spirit. The Wrights didn't just ride, they opened a shop, repaired machines, and eventually began manufacturing their own high-quality brand, the Van Cleve. This bicycle shop became their laboratory, the place where they learned the nuances of balance, the strength of lightweight materials, and the importance of precision craftsmanship. But beneath the hum of bicycle chains and the smell of grease, the old memory of the flying toy began to stir once again. In 1896, the world was shocked by the death of Otto Lilienthal, the German glider king, who broke his spine after his glider stalled and crashed. Lilienthal had been the closest man to a bird the world had ever seen, and his death signaled to most that human flight was a suicide mission. However, for the Wright brothers, the tragedy had the opposite effect. It did not scare them off, but rather galvanized them to understand why he had failed. They realized that while other inventors were obsessed with powerful engines, the true problem of flight was not power, but control. They understood that a flying machine was like a bicycle. It was inherently unstable and required a pilot to constantly balance it against the shifting air. This insight was their first great leap of genius, distinguishing them from the wealthy, educated engineers who were trying to build stable, heavy-winged ships. The brothers wrote to the Smithsonian Institution, asking for every scrap of literature on aerodynamics, and with that humble request, the clock began to tick on the age of aviation. Chapter 2: The Secret of the Birds. The brothers dove into the existing literature with the fervor of converts, devouring the works of Cayley, Chanute, and Langley. They quickly discovered that much of the data was theoretical, contradictory, or simply wrong, leaving them to navigate a fog of scientific uncertainty. They turned their eyes away from the books and toward the sky, spending hours lying on their backs in the fields outside Dayton, watching buzzards and hawks navigate the wind. They noticed something crucial: birds did not keep their wings rigid like the gliders of the past. They twisted the tips of their wings to roll and bank against the turbulence. This observation led to the concept of wing warping, the revolutionary idea that a pilot could mechanically twist the wings of a craft to control its roll. The breakthrough came not in a wind tunnel, but in the bicycle shop, while Wilbur was idly absent-minded, twisting a long, rectangular inner-tube box in his hands. As he twisted the ends of the cardboard box in opposite directions, he realized that the structure remained rigid while the aerodynamic surface changed, exactly what was needed for a wing. Imagine the electric tension in that dusty shop as Wilbur rushed to show Orville, realizing that a discarded cardboard box held the key to the sky. To test this radical theory, they did not build a full-sized man-carrying machine immediately, but started with a large, biplane kite in the summer of 1899. They controlled the kite from the ground using four strings that manipulated the wing tips, mimicking the torsion they had observed in the birds. When the kite responded to their commands, banking and leveling off at will, they knew they had unlocked a secret that had eluded humanity for millennia. It was a victory of pure intellect and observation, proving that the problem of flight could be solved through mechanical principles rather than brute force. However, a kite is not a glider, and a glider is not a powered airplane. The leap from a tethered model to a man-carrying craft was immense. They needed a place to test their theories, a laboratory that offered steady winds, soft sand for landings, and isolation from the prying eyes of the press. They wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau, analyzing wind velocity tables for locations across the country, searching for the perfect storm of conditions. They settled on a remote, harsh strip of barrier islands off the coast of North Carolina, a place known to locals as the Outer Banks. The specific spot was a tiny fishing hamlet called Kitty Hawk, a place so isolated that it was barely a dot on the map. The brothers were warned by the local postmaster about the inhospitable terrain, the storms, and the utter lack of amenities, but this only hardened their resolve. They were not looking for a vacation, they were looking for a wind tunnel provided by nature, a place where the elements were raw and consistent. It is hard to overstate the courage it took for two Midwestern city boys to pack their crates and head into this wilderness, leaving behind their business and their comfort. Their preparation was meticulous, utilizing the profits from the bicycle season to purchase high-quality spruce, ash, and muslin fabric. They sewed the wing coverings themselves on their mother's old sewing machine, the white fabric billowing in the living room like the sails of a ghost ship. Every rib and strut was calculated, every ounce of weight debated, as they prepared to transport their fragile machine hundreds of miles by train and boat. They were stepping out of the theoretical and into the physical, a transition that has broken the hearts of countless inventors before them. As they packed their trunks, they were also packing away their anonymity, though they did not know it yet. They were venturing into a world of sand and wind that would strip them to their core, testing not just their machine, but their brotherhood and their sanity. The journey to Kitty Hawk was the crossing of a threshold, a point of no return where they would either die as eccentrics or live as immortals. The stage was set for a drama that would play out on the lonely dunes, where the only applause would come from the crashing of the Atlantic waves. Chapter 3: Into the Wilderness. The journey to Kitty Hawk in September of 1900 was an odyssey in itself, a jarring transition from the civilized order of Ohio to the untamed frontier of the coast. Wilbur went first, navigating a nightmare of delays, missed connections, and a terrifying boat ride across the Albemarle Sound in a leaking skiff that nearly foundered in a gale. When he finally arrived, he found a desolate landscape of shifting sands, sparse vegetation, and a wind that never seemed to cease its howling. It was a place that felt more like the surface of another planet than a part of America, alien and indifferent to human ambition. Orville arrived weeks later, bringing the rest of the supplies and the precious camping gear that would be their home for the coming months. They set up a white canvas tent on the sand, a fragile shelter against the ferocious Atlantic storms that battered the coast with frightening regularity. The isolation was absolute. There were no hotels, no restaurants, and the few locals who lived there were hardened fishermen who looked upon the brothers with a mix of amusement and suspicion. Imagine trying to conduct the most precise scientific experiment in history while living like castaways, cooking beans over a kerosene stove and shaking sand out of your blankets every night. Their 1900 glider was a biplane design, a beautiful, fragile kite made of wood and wire, with a wingspan of 17 feet. It was designed to be flown first as a kite, controlled by ropes from the ground, to test the lift and the wing warping mechanism safely. The first time they launched it into the steady ocean breeze, the ropes grew taut, and the machine rose into the air with an eagerness that made their hearts race. It was alive, straining against the tether, responding to the wind with a complex dance of physics that they had only imagined on paper. However, the reality of the lift was disappointing. The glider did not generate nearly as much upward force as the standard calculations of the day had predicted. They had relied on the Smeaton coefficient, a number used by engineers for over a century to calculate air pressure, and for the first time, they began to suspect that the entire scientific world might be wrong. This was a terrifying realization, that the map they were using to navigate the unknown was fundamentally flawed. Yet, rather than give up, they adjusted their expectations, flying the machine as a kite for hours, measuring the pull and the angle with obsessive precision. They did manage a few manned glides that first year, brief, heart-stopping moments where one of them would lie prone on the lower wing. The sensation of the Earth dropping away, even for just a few seconds, was intoxicating, a drug that justified all the hardship and expense. But these flights were short and dangerous, totaling only a few minutes of actual airtime across the entire expedition. The pilot lay exposed on the wing, staring down at the rushing sand, controlling the pitch with a forward elevator, a canard that they hoped would prevent the deadly stalls that killed Lilienthal. The conditions at camp were punishing. Fine sand worked its way into their food, their eyes, and their mechanical drawings. But in their letters home to their sister Catherine, they described the beauty of the sunsets and the thrill of the chase, downplaying the misery to protect their family from worry. There was a profound joy in their suffering, a purity of purpose that bound them together against the elements. They were monks of the wind, dedicated to a liturgy of lift and drag that no one else understood. As the season turned and the weather worsened, they packed up their camp, leaving the battered glider behind in the sand. They returned to Dayton not with a triumph, but with a collection of data that raised more questions than it answered. They had tasted flight, but they had also tasted the bitterness of error, realizing that the road ahead was longer and steeper than they had feared. They were not defeated, but they were sobered. Understanding now that they would have to rewrite the science of aerodynamics from scratch if they ever hoped to truly fly. Chapter 4: The War on Error. Back in the familiar confines of the bicycle shop, the winter of 1901 became a season of intense intellectual combat. The brothers were haunted by the failure of their lift calculations, nor by the suspicion that the accepted scientific tables were nothing more than guesses. They decided to return to Kitty Hawk in 1901 with a much larger glider, a massive machine with a 22-foot wingspan, hoping that increased size would compensate for the lack of lift. They were betting everything on size, hoping that brute surface area would overcome the invisible deficiencies in their math. The 1901 expedition, however, proved to be a crushing psychological blow, perhaps the lowest point in their entire journey. The new glider was unruly and dangerous, it pitched violently, and the wing-warping mechanism, which had worked so well on the smaller craft, caused the large glider to spin out of control. On several occasions, they narrowly escaped death as the machine stalled and plunged into the dunes, crumpling the wood and tearing the fabric. It is hard to believe, but at the end of that summer, Wilbur, usually the stoic rock of the partnership, turned to Orville and despairingly predicted that men would not fly for 50 years. They returned to Dayton in a state of deep gloom, their confidence shattered by the unpredictable behavior of the air. But it was in this darkness that their true genius emerged. They refused to accept the failure as final. They realized that they could not rely on Lilienthal, or Smeaton, or anyone else. They had to trust only themselves. They decided to stop guessing and start measuring, building a device that would allow them to see the invisible forces at work. They constructed a wind tunnel, a crude wooden box 6 feet long with a glass window on top, powered by a fan connected to a gas engine. It looked like a coffin, but inside it, they birthed the future of aviation. They forged tiny, delicate balances made of hacksaw blades and bicycle spokes to measure the lift and drag of miniature wing shapes. For weeks, they ran the fan, testing hundreds of different airfoils, meticulously recording the data in notebooks, creating the first accurate database of aerodynamic pressures in history. The wind tunnel revealed the truth: the world was indeed wrong. The accepted Smeaton coefficient was off by nearly 40%, a massive error that explained why their gliders had fallen from the sky. They also discovered that the shape of the wing, the camber, needed to be much flatter than the bird-like curves everyone else was copying. This was the turning point, the moment they stopped being mechanics and became scientists of the highest order. They were no longer stumbling in the dark, they were mapping the physics of the atmosphere. With the new data, they built the 1902 glider, a machine that looked similar to its predecessors but was radically different in its geometry. They added a crucial innovation, a movable rear rudder, to work in concert with the wing warping, solving the deadly problem of adverse yaw that had plagued the 1901 craft. When they took this new machine to the Outer Banks, the difference was magical. It didn't just float, it flew. They made hundreds of glides, soaring for over 600 feet, battling high winds, and landing with the grace of the gulls they had studied for so long. The locals, who had watched the crazy bicycle men with pity, now watched in awe as the brothers soared above the dunes, banking and turning with complete control. The 1902 glider was the first true aircraft in history, lacking only an engine to sustain it. The brothers knew they had cracked the code, they had solved the problem of balance and control. The final piece of the puzzle was power, and as they packed up that season, the roar of an engine was already echoing in their minds. They left the coast with light hearts, knowing that the next time they returned, it would be to make history. The years of struggle, the dangerous crashes, the sleepless nights in the wind tunnel, it was all converging on a single point in time. They were ready to build the Flyer, the machine that would sever the bond between man and Earth forever. The dream was no longer a dream, it was a blueprint, waiting to be built. Chapter 5: The Heart of the Machine. The brothers returned to Dayton in late 1902 with the secret of aerodynamics unlocked, but they faced a new, formidable barrier: the need for a lightweight engine. They required a motor that weighed less than 200 pounds yet produced at least 8 horsepower, a ratio that seemed impossible to the automotive manufacturers of the day. They wrote to a dozen automobile companies, soliciting a custom engine, but the replies were unanimous in their rejection or their confusion. The industry was in its infancy, accustomed to heavy iron blocks and clattering pistons, and the idea of a featherweight engine for a flying machine seemed like a fool's errand. Undeterred, the brothers turned to the only man they could trust, the unsung third hero of this saga, Charlie Taylor, the machinist who ran their bicycle shop while they were away. Taylor was a rough-hewn genius with a lathe, a man who could turn a block of metal into a singing instrument of power. Lacking the time for complex castings, Taylor carved the engine block from a solid chunk of aluminum, a rare and expensive material at the time, marking one of the first times the metal was used in engine construction. In just 6 weeks, amidst the smell of hot oil and metal shavings, Taylor built a 4-cylinder engine that defied expectations, producing not 8, but 12 horsepower. With the heart of the machine beating, the brothers turned to the limbs, the propellers. They assumed, quite logically, that marine engineering had already solved the physics of screw propellers and that they could simply adapt data from shipbuilding. They went to the library, pulling down dusty tomes on naval architecture, only to find a chaotic void of empirical guesswork. Shipbuilders, it turned out, had been using trial and error for decades, and there was no formula that could be applied to the thin, invisible medium of the air. Wilbur and Orville were forced to invent a new branch of physics, realizing that a propeller is simply a wing traveling in a spiral. This was a staggering intellectual leap. They understood that the blades had to be twisted along their length to maintain a constant angle of attack as the speed of rotation increased toward the tips. They filled notebooks with calculations of thrust and torque, arguing heatedly across the parlor room, their voices rising as they mentally wrestled with the invisible forces. It is humbling to imagine these two men, with no formal education in fluid dynamics, solving complex calculus problems in their heads while the rest of the world slept. They hand-carved the propellers from laminated spruce, using a hatchet and a draw knife, shaping the wood until it was as smooth as glass. The tips were painted with aluminum to prevent splitting, and when they tested them in the shop, the thrust was so powerful it nearly tore the testing apparatus apart. They had created the most efficient aerial propellers the world had ever seen, with an efficiency rate of 66%, a figure that modern engineers, with computers and composites, have only marginally improved upon. By the autumn of 1903, the components were ready: the aluminum engine, the spruce propellers, and the muslin wings. They packed the Flyer into crates, labeling them with a mixture of anxiety and hope, and shipped them once more to the desolate sands of the Outer Banks. They were no longer testing gliders, they were bringing a machine designed to leave the Earth under its own power. The bicycle mechanics were now aerospace engineers, standing on the precipice of a new age. But the machine was not just wood and wire, it was a manifestation of their will. Every screw, every stitch of fabric, and every drop of glue represented a choice to defy the accepted limits of their species. As the train carried them toward the coast, they carried the weight of history with them, knowing that failure now would not just be a disappointment, but a validation of the critics who said it couldn't be done. They were sailing toward the edge of the known world. Chapter 6: Destiny on the Dunes. Arriving at Kitty Hawk in late September 1903, the brothers found their camp in shambles, battered by winter storms and neglected during their absence. They spent precious weeks repairing their shed and building a hangar for the new machine, all while fighting a clock that was ticking toward the freezing winter. The weather was atrocious, with biting winds and torrential rains that turned the sand into a slurry, making work miserable and testing their patience. To make matters worse, the propeller shafts they had designed proved too brittle, twisting and snapping during ground tests, forcing Orville to make a desperate trip back to Dayton to forge stronger steel shafts. The isolation of the Outer Banks felt heavier that year, the silence of the dunes amplified by the roaring anxiety of the impending attempt. They were joined by a few men from the nearby Kill Devil Hills life-saving station, rugged Coast Guardsmen who watched the brothers with a mixture of curiosity and deep respect. These men, weather-beaten, stoic, and accustomed to the tragedies of the sea, would become the unwitting witnesses to history. It is strange to think that the only audience for the greatest technological leap of the century was a handful of surfmen and a stray dog. By December, the Flyer was finally assembled, a beautiful, menacing insect of white fabric and dark wood, sitting on a 60-foot wooden launching rail. The brothers tossed a coin to see who would take the first crack at immortality. Wilbur won the toss. On December 14th, they hauled the machine up the slope of a sand dune, hoping to use gravity to assist the takeoff. The engine roared to life, a jagged, coughing sound that shattered the stillness of the coast, startling the seabirds into flight. Wilbur climbed into the hip cradle, his heart surely pounding against the ribs of his jacket, and released the restraining wire. The machine lurched forward, but Wilbur, perhaps too eager, pulled up too sharply on the elevator. The Flyer climbed steeply, stalled, and crashed into the sand with a sickening crunch, damaging the front rudder and a skid. It was a failure, brief and humiliating, lasting only 3.5 seconds. The crash cast a pall over the camp, time was running out, and the winter gales were becoming more ferocious by the day. They spent 2 days frantically repairing the broken struts, their fingers numb from the cold, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They knew they might only get one more chance before the weather made flight impossible until spring. The pressure was suffocating, a single mistake, a single gust of wind, and the year would be lost. On the morning of December 17th, the puddles around the camp were frozen over with ice, and a biting north wind was blowing at 27 miles per hour. It was weather that grounded birds, weather that sensible men stayed inside for. But the brothers looked at each other and made the decision: today was the day. They hung a signal sheet on the side of the shed to summon the life-saving crew, realizing that destiny would not wait for a calm day. They laid the launching track on the flat sand, pointing it directly into the teeth of the gale. The wind was so strong that it threatened to flip the parked airplane over, requiring the brothers to hold the wingtips down. Orville, having lost the coin toss 3 days earlier, now took his turn at the controls. He positioned himself prone on the lower wing, staring out at the grey horizon, the engine vibrating through his chest. Chapter 7, 12 Seconds That Changed the World. At 10:35 a.m., with the wind howling through the struts, Orville released the wire that held the flyer back. The machine moved forward slowly against the fierce headwind, so slowly that Wilbur was able to run alongside it, his hand resting on the wingtip to steady it. Imagine that moment, a man running beside a machine that was about to break the bonds of gravity, his feet kicking up sand, his coat flapping wildly. As the speed increased, Wilbur let go, and the flyer lifted from the rail. It did not rocket into the sky, it rose tentatively, fighting the turbulent air, dipping and rising like a boat on a rough sea. Orville wrestled with the controls, the sensitive front elevator causing the craft to pitch up and down erratically. But it was flying. It was not sliding, it was not gliding, it was generating its own lift, carrying a man into the air under the power of an engine. One of the life-saving men, John T. Daniels, had been entrusted with Orville's box camera and told to squeeze the bulb if the machine left the ground. In a panic of excitement, he snapped the shutter, capturing perhaps the most famous photograph in human history. It shows the flyer hovering just a few feet above the ground, Orville stiff at the controls, and Wilbur standing in the sand, watching his life's work rise above him. The flight lasted only 12 seconds. The machine covered a distance of 120 feet, less than the wingspan of a modern Boeing 747. It ended with a sudden dart into the sand, cracking a skid, but the brothers stepped away from the wreckage with the quiet knowledge that the world had changed. They had done it. They had piloted a powered, heavier-than-air machine, sustained it in flight, and landed it on ground as high as that from which it had started. They made 3 more flights that day, taking turns, each one longer and more confident than the last. The final flight, with Wilbur at the controls, lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet, a triumphant sustained glide that proved the first success was no fluke. But as they discussed the flight, a sudden gust of wind caught the parked flyer, flipping it over and tumbling it across the sand, smashing it into a pile of kindling. The machine would never fly again, but its purpose had been served. After packing the broken remains, the brothers walked for miles to the weather station to send a telegram to their father. It was brief, understated, and factual: success for flights Thursday morning. Average speed through air 31 miles, longest 57 seconds. Inform press home Christmas. They did not brag, they simply reported the news. That evening, they ate a cold dinner in their drafty shack, shivering in the darkness. Yet, one can imagine the warmth that radiated between them. They were the only 2 men on Earth who knew the secret, the only 2 who had seen the view from the other side of the impossible. The wind howled outside, but it no longer mocked them, it was now a force they had mastered. Chapter 8, The Long Silence. One would expect that the news of human flight would be greeted with ticker-tape parades and headlines screaming across the globe. Instead, the world greeted the Wright brothers with a deafening silence and a shrug of indifference. The telegram was leaked to the press, but the story was mangled, exaggerated, or dismissed as a tall tale from 2 eccentric bicycle mechanics. Most editors, burned by previous hoaxes and the failure of the highly funded Samuel Langley just weeks prior, simply refused to believe it. The brothers returned to Dayton, not as conquering heroes, but as men with a secret that nobody wanted to hear. They needed a place to perfect their machine, to turn the fragile jumper of Kitty Hawk into a practical aircraft. They found a cow pasture 8 miles outside of Dayton called Huffman Prairie. It was a humid, grassy field filled with hummocks and surrounded by trees, a terrible place to fly compared to the steady winds of the coast. Here, throughout 1904 and 1905, the brothers waged a private war against the limitations of their craft. They built a catapult, a derrick with a dropping weight, to hurl the plane into the air, compensating for the lack of wind. They flew in circles, banking the machine steep and hard, mastering the art of the turn. On many days, the few passengers on the passing interurban trolley would look out the window and see a white mechanical bird buzzing over the cows, shaking their heads in disbelief before returning to their newspapers. The press was invited once, but the engine sputtered and the plane failed to fly, confirming the reporters' skepticism. After that, the Wrights adopted a policy of secrecy. They stopped inviting the public, they flew only when no cameras were present. They were afraid of spies stealing their design, but they were also driven by a puritanical pride. They wanted to present a finished, perfect product, not a work in progress. By October 1905, they had built the Flyer 3, the first practical airplane in history. Wilbur flew it for 39 minutes, circling the pasture until he ran out of gas. They could now fly until they got bored, landing gently at the exact spot of takeoff. They had conquered the air completely, yet the world still considered them frauds. Scientific American published articles mocking the alleged flights, and the U.S. Army threw their letters into the trash. This period, the gap years of aviation, is one of the most surreal chapters in history. We had the technology to fly, but for nearly 5 years, it existed only in a muddy field in Ohio, unseen by the kings, presidents, and generals who would soon covet it. The brothers simply parked the plane, disassembled it, and went back to selling bicycles. They waited, with an ironclad patience, for the world to come to them on their terms. It is a testament to their character that they did not despair or seek cheap publicity. They knew what they had. They held the patent, they held the knowledge, and they held the future. They sat in their bicycle shop, surrounded by tires and chains, knowing that they were the only 2 pilots on the planet. Chapter 9, The Triumph in France. The silence finally broke in 1908 when the brothers signed contracts with a French syndicate and the U.S. Army. The terms required them to split up. Orville would stay in America to demonstrate the machine to the military, while Wilbur would travel to France to prove their claims to a skeptical Europe. The French press had been particularly vicious, calling the brothers bluffers, and insisting that French aviators, who were making short, clumsy hops, were the true leaders of flight. Wilbur arrived at the Hunaudiers racecourse near Le Mans in August 1908. The crowd was hostile, filled with cynicism and national pride, waiting for the American to fail. Wilbur, wearing a grey cap and a leather jacket, looked more like a mechanic than a hero. He calmly checked his machine, ignoring the jeers, his face a mask of concentration. When he took off, the skepticism evaporated in a matter of seconds. Wilbur didn't just fly, he carved the air. He banked the plane in tight, elegant circles, dipping the wingtips toward the grass, controlling the craft with a fluidity that the French had never imagined. The French aviators, who fought their machines like wild animals, watched with their mouths open. One French pilot, crying tears of shame and admiration, whispered, "We are as children." Over the next few weeks, Wilbur became the most famous man in the world. Kings, queens, and millionaires flocked to the muddy field to watch him fly. He set record after record for altitude, duration, and distance. He took passengers up, including women, treating them to the view of the gods. The bluffer was now the king of the air. Meanwhile, in America, Orville was dazzling the army at Fort Myer, Virginia. He flew for over an hour, smashing world records daily. The brothers, separated by an ocean, were united in a global triumph. The years of ridicule were washed away by the roar of their engines. They had forced the world to look up, and the world was unable to look away. The letters between the brothers during this time reveal their deep bond. They did not gloat about the fame, they discussed radiator temperatures and oil pressure. They remained grounded even as they spent their days in the clouds. But the shadow of tragedy was never far behind the bright light of their success. Chapter 10, Tragedy and Legacy. The euphoria of 1908 was shattered on September 17 at Fort Myer. During a demonstration flight, a propeller blade on Orville's plane split, tangling with a wire and sending the machine crashing into the ground from a height of 75 feet. Orville was pulled from the wreckage with a broken leg and 4 broken ribs. His passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, was killed, the first fatality in the history of powered aviation. The crash was a brutal reminder that the air was a dangerous mistress. Orville suffered from the pain of his injuries for the rest of his life, a constant physical toll paid for his ambition. Wilbur rushed back from France, shaken to his core. The accident introduced a note of mortality into their story. The sky was conquered, but it demanded blood. The following years were consumed not by flying, but by the ugly, grinding machinery of business and law. The brothers spent their time in courtrooms, fighting patent battles against Glenn Curtis and other rivals who sought to steal their invention. The joy of discovery was replaced by the stress of litigation. Wilbur, the visionary, found himself exhausted by the endless arguments and the greed of competitors. In 1912, worn down by the stress and weakened by fatigue, Wilbur contracted typhoid fever. He lingered for weeks in the family home, drifting in and out of consciousness. On May 30th, the elder brother, the quiet giant who had first twisted the cardboard box, died at the age of 45. His father, Bishop Wright, wrote simply in his diary, "A short life, full of consequences." An unfailing intellect, imperturbable temper, great self-reliance and as great modesty. Orville lived on for another 36 years, a lonely figure who walked with a limp and tinkered in his workshop. He saw the airplane evolve from a wood and wire curiosity into a weapon of war, watching with horror as bombers leveled cities in Europe. He famously remarked that he did not regret the invention, but he regretted how humanity had used it. He had given the world wings, but he could not give it the wisdom to use them for peace. Closing summary. As we look back at the saga of the Wright brothers, we are left with a story that is far more than a technical achievement. It is a parable of human potential. Wilbur and Orville Wright were not supermen, they were ordinary men possessed by an extraordinary idea. They remind us that the future is not built by the loud, the wealthy, or the powerful, but by the curious, the persistent, and the brave. They taught us that the impossible is often just a problem waiting for the right mind to solve it. They showed us that failure is not a wall, but a door that must be pushed open. Today, every time a jetliner traces a white line across the stratosphere, every time a satellite pings the Earth, and every time a human looks up at the stars with a sense of belonging, we are living in the world the Wright brothers built. Their legacy is not just in the aluminum and steel that fills our skies, but in the spirit of the endeavor. They broke the chains of gravity, but more importantly, they broke the chains of our own self-doubt. They proved that if we are willing to endure the wind, the sand, and the silence, we too can find a way to fly. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you made it this far, you're the reason we keep going. Please subscribe and help us continue sharing these stories with the world.